How has life really been in Shanghai these past 30 days? To help us answer this question, I've invited Frank Tsai, a Chinese American who has lived and worked in China for the past 15 years. Frank is the founder of China Crossroads, the largest platform of public lectures in Shanghai, and a visiting lecturer in international studies at Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University. Frank joins us live from his apartment in Shanghai, where he has been locked down for over 3 consecutive weeks. Frank shares his stories on how his community has been coming together to overcome this latest COVID challenge, and we also discuss some of the bigger differences between both China and America's COVID response. Today's episode of Real Talk China is proudly sponsored by Surfshark VPN, a longtime sponsor of this channel and my go-to VPN service provider. Surfshark is a product that I use every day in both my personal and professional life, and if you are in the market for a VPN to help keep your data more secure online, I highly recommend Surfshark VPN. Simply use my promo code CYRUS at checkout and you will receive an amazing 83% off the retail purchase price. In addition, because you're a loyal subscriber of this channel, Surfshark will throw in an additional 4 months of service for free. Simply click the link in the description below to get started. And Frank, thank you so much for joining me here on Real Talk China.
Thank you. I'm honored to be on your program.
I want you to tell the audience a little bit about your company, China Crossroads.
Yeah, sure. China Crossroads is the largest organizer of public lectures in Shanghai. So I run about 70 talks a year on China and the world. I founded the company in the middle of the pandemic in May 2020. And that's a thing I always like to say, because only in China could you found an events company dependent on in-person gatherings in the middle of the pandemic, May 2020. Right. I understand very well why Chinese are very proud of their zero COVID performance, because we had a life here that they didn't have back in the West. Right. We had a normal life for 2 years. China is rightly proud of this. When the West doesn't understand that we had a normal life, you can look at CNN, over the last 2 years. They always make it seem that, there's checks on the street or we're locked down more than we are. I had never been locked down until 3 weeks ago. It's so sensationalist. It really quite annoyed me that the Western media really never understood that China had a normal life for these 2 years.
Yeah, and I think there's a point that you had brought up. I saw on one of your LinkedIn posts, through this pandemic, I think you've given 134 in-person events in China, during this pandemic, which is quite amazing because, I've been in Canada this entire pandemic. We've seen, very strict lockdowns here. We've also seen, for example, in-person events completely canceled. So, you wouldn't have been able to do that in the Western world at all, have 134 events. So
China's success in zero COVID is not just the government, it's the people. The people got together and made sure that case counts would be low. And this is an accomplishment of the Chinese people. When the West doesn't recognize that accomplishment and in fact says that, you're hiding numbers, or, it's really worse than you say, or you may have accomplished that, but you've robbed people of their civil liberties, that pisses people off. This is a huge accomplishment, a 2-year accomplishment that the Chinese people should be proud of. And so when Chinese get more nationalistic and say, well, I don't believe what the West says anymore, I don't believe the BBC or CNN, I can actually quite understand that when you're not recognized, by these other people who are judging you.
But Frank, well, let's go ahead and fast forward to right now, because obviously we've seen things have turned, things have changed differently. I think the big thing that happened is there were some cases that emerged in Shanghai. The local government there decided to do things a little bit different. Initially, the government had said, we're not going to go into a full lockdown, as this would affect both the domestic and international economies. They tried a different strategy. For example, they were locking down different parts of the city. And then we saw the central government from Beijing come in and really put the entire city into a lockdown.
I think it's very important to know this. There's no way the Shanghai government would have allowed this to happen given its own devices, because this is a well-run, rational administration. Mm-hmm. A little more than a month ago, it said that we will not have lockdowns. Of course, we've had lockdowns. So it's a pretty easy reading of the tea leaves that, Beijing took over the lockdown, the central government did. And that's why Shanghai's had a scramble. There's no way that, Shanghai wants people to, not have all the food they can get. There's no way Shanghai would have done this had it had a long lead time to plan. So It's really the central government being very concerned about the explosion of cases. Shanghai definitely did drop the ball because there was a huge iceberg submerged that it didn't know about, and
Right.
turns out there are a lot of cases out in society. That being said, though, I mean, I think the Shanghainese I talk to say, well, this is because the central government's taken over, and we've really lost a lot of our autonomy.
So tell us a little bit about just the food problems, because we've heard a lot in Western media that people are starving in Shanghai. I'd like to just get your perspective. And your entire building. How does this whole
Sure.
process work?
Yeah. Especially in the first week, we were quite anxious about food because none of the apps were working. The reason is that delivery workers are either locked down or they don't have the permissions to be essential workers and be out. And so Shanghai had a huge shortfall of delivery workers. Had there been no shortfall, we still have problems. There's never been a time ever when 26 million people are all home ordering food, right?
Right, right.
It's a huge issue. So we couldn't get all the food we could in a timely manner. We've had to bulk buy with our neighbors. Now, to explain that a bit, I live in a building with 300 people. So the neighbors coordinate and we buy pork in bulk, vegetables in bulk, this kind of thing. It's a very time-consuming process because these WeChat groups go by very fast, and you have to be attentive, or you'll miss the group buy.
Right.
We do get our food that way, but we don't get a huge amount of choice in what we get.
Frank, let's talk about the price, because one of the things that we're
Yeah.
seeing here in the West is a very big rise in inflation. We've seen prices anywhere from 10 to 20% higher in the grocery stores in the last couple of months, just as inflation is setting in. Obviously, we've got a war going on in Europe. We have a lot of logistical chain supply issues that are happening as well. What about these group buys and things? Have you seen a lot of price gouging? Have you seen, has the cost of, for example, when you're getting that pork or your coffee, your cigarettes, or your rice, are these costs extreme, or are they relatively controlled as well?
I have a graphic I can show you later. It's an order for a pack of vegetables, and actually it's fruit. It's bananas and some nice fruit. It was $100. So that's something I want to post at some point because that's gouging.
Okay. Yeah.
The government has said we're going to crack down on gouging, but I don't know. It can't crack down on everything.
Right.
My experience is only one, but I haven't seen a huge price gouging.
Okay.
Not in group buying anyway.
How about in your apartment? I mean, your complex there with 300 people. Do you have any people with some underlying health conditions that are, have needed some medical help and haven't been able to get that treatment?
People with medical conditions, especially in the first 2 weeks, have not had timely access to health care, and this is pretty widespread. We're locked in. No, we're not locked in, but we're not supposed to leave our buildings, and so it's not easy if you have an emergency to the doctor. A lot of medical staff are testing, right? This is a huge effort. The doctors and staff have been sent in from other provinces, right? So there's less hospital capacity. So if you have an underlying condition, I really feel sorry for you. Or if you're an old person who has a heart attack or something, an emergency, I do feel sorry for you. And I am pretty confident the number of deaths resulting from the lockdown will far exceed the 10 reported yesterday from COVID, right?
Yeah.
So
and that's been a big concern of mine as well, is that some of this collateral damage. I mean, I think like you had said, I mean, you're thinking in a city of 25 million people, how many women are pregnant right now in that city?
Exactly.
That'd be a lot, right? I mean, how many?
Yes.
China has a very large elderly population to begin with. A lot of the elderly do have underlying conditions, whether it would be, maybe asthma or, maybe some type of cancer. They need treatment. They need, constant medical attention. There could be potentially, I think that's a big concern for myself, is saying, look, there's a lot of other medical problems that need to be addressed. And I worry if those are properly being addressed in Shanghai during these really tight lockdowns. You are getting tested every 48 hours. And is that the opportunity for you then to get out of your apartment? You can go down to the lobby and get tested, and then you need to go right back up? Is that still happening right now?
This is also a really important point. So according to the regulations, I'm not supposed to leave my building.
Right.
So you've seen them. If there's a case within 14 days, you can't leave your building until it's been 7 days, right? Until the case is 7 days. But from the very beginning, I've been able to live in my building, but just outside and hang out, right? We also have trees and a compound that I can't go to.
Right.
But I think I've been fortunate. Some people are not as fortunate. They just can't even leave their building. They can't even see the sun.
Right.
And I have a friend too who's actually, his door is taped down, and if he leaves his building, if he leaves his home, they'll know he left his home because there's too many cases in his building. So
Wow.
there's a lot of local implementation too. So different neighborhood communities, they will do things differently depending on personalities and depending on what they want.
And I want to bring up this interesting quote and from a professor, but this
Sure,
is
yeah.
from Yang Guobing, who is a professor at University of Pennsylvania. And what he did is he was sharing the difference, kind of the psychological difference between the first lockdown in Wuhan and then this new lockdown in Shanghai. And he said, when people respond to the same crisis twice, they are more likely to be united the first time and divided the second time. This is because the first time they are ignorant about the nature of the crisis, and blissful ignorance is conducive to unity. But the second time, with the same crisis hits, people have learned something about it, or at least some people think they have. This limited knowledge leads to division, and some will think that they know better than others. Others are no longer as scared of the crisis. I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on this, because I think we do hear some stories of, for example, these group buys where, people are saying, hey, let's get together, let's buy some things together. I've heard a lot of stories of neighbors helping out. Here's some fruit for you. You need some medicine, I can help you out. Do you see this being more of the truth, that people are coming together similar to Wuhan, or do you think that the professor here is a little bit right, that actually there's a little bit more division and that there's different viewpoints on this specific lockdown in Shanghai?
He's a pretty prominent scholar of China, and he knows a lot about the internet in China. So I'm a bit bashful in saying this, but I think he's wrong about this. And why? There's a fundamental issue here, which is that though the educated Chinese do pay attention to social media, it's not that realistic. It's not that reliable, really. And a lot of Chinese don't pay attention to social media still.
Right.
Do you think that the Wuhan problems were reported in CCTV? They were not.
Right.
Do you think that our Shanghai problems are reported in CCTV? Of course they're not.
Right.
I saw some video recently shared around of CCTV reporting that the supermarkets are all full of people. Now that was one district in Shanghai. So this is a problem with this is a characteristic of the state, that it doesn't want it wants to guide the information. It doesn't want to report all the negative news. So if something bad is happening in one city, we're not going to really totally know about that. One characteristic of the state is that it does not want to it doesn't want to encourage civil society to organize on its own. If I know something is happening, in Wuhan, maybe I can talk to them and I can start allying with them, and I can become a force that may oppose certain government policies or actors. But that's what the state doesn't allow, partly because it is Leninist, in the sense that it has a ruling party that has 100 million members, and that party tries to guide society in the interests of national goals, which are good or bad, but its purpose is to make sure that society is on the same program with the nation. The main takeaway is that most of China is not truly aware, I think, of the detailed difficulties that are happening in Shanghai. But let me put a more positive kind of interpretation on this. So the vast majority of Chinese, it depends on the numbers. I've seen numbers that 26% of Chinese are in lockdown now. It's not like us. It's lighter lockdown. I think it's more like 85% of Chinese have never been locked down like us.
Right.
And they're going to be more supportive of zero COVID because they just don't know what a lockdown is, and it's not fully reported in the media.
Right.
But if I don't want to say it's positive, it's actually negative. But if China has more lockdowns, I think support with zero COVID will go down, because among my friends in Shanghai, there's been a shift. The first week, as you would expect, everybody's supporting zero COVID, right? I mean, it's a huge point of pride for China. But as people know, more and more friends or relatives who get sent to social quarantine, or they can't get their medicines on time or go to the hospital, of course they turn against it. And so I would say right now in Shanghai, the opinion is quite against the lockdown. I mean, in my unscientific way. I don't think it's an overwhelming majority. And, in my personal life, I thank the health staff. I'm grateful for them. I'm in a well-run compound. I think they're working very hard. I'm not going to protest anything. I want to be respectful. But, and I think most Shanghainese are that way, but they're also thinking this is just irrational, right? Because it's a huge amount of isolation and other inconveniences, but also suffering. And, I don't want to sound too one-sided. We also know that if we have a Hong Kong-style outbreak in China, it's going to be 1 million+ deaths. So the government has its reasons as well. What I'm much more concerned about is that, zero COVID has become politicized, it's become an end in itself. It's become some shining ideal, and with some echoes of the past, where we know in Chinese history, other things have become a shining ideal, a socialist paradise. I'm not saying that we have the same kind of system as before, but there's a muscle memory to any people and how they operate. And you're going to take the stories and the memes from the past and use them. And I'm afraid that it's China's using some of the more harmful aspects of its political heritage since 1949 in controlling COVID and getting people on board with this.
What do you think for the future of Shanghai? I mean, in your expectation, what's the kind of sentiment? I mean, do you believe that you're going to be on lockdown for a couple more weeks? Do you see this wrapping up anytime soon? I mean, can you give any prediction on how much longer until the situation gets under control and Shanghai can reopen?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to predict. I mean, if you'd asked me a week ago, I probably would have said by late May things would be back to normal because I've had a lot of confidence in this government's ability to control this. But I didn't know we'd have 20,000 cases a day either. So, worst case scenario, rolling lockdowns for a long time. Best case scenario, we're kind of like Shenzhen, which came out of it very well. Of course, they didn't have that many cases, and from what I hear from my friends, is they have a pretty normal life right now. Yeah. So I'm not sure I have much of a prediction about that in terms of the actual situation on the ground. Of course, myself as an event organizer, of course, I hope things go back to normal as soon as possible.
And I think the key metric there will be monitoring the cases that are these new infections that continue to mysteriously arise in Shanghai. Like you said, everyone has been locked down for almost a minimum of 3 weeks, sometimes even longer at this point. But yet there's still new cases emerging in society. That's really the metric that China wants to monitor. So I still think that we're probably a few weeks away from getting this the transmission in society under control. That was the metric that Shenzhen used. As soon as that went down to zero, that's when they started reopening.
When Shanghai had the freedom to do what it wanted, it allowed case counts or underlying case counts, the iceberg under the water, to get too big, and it was put down. Many abuses we see or in China over its history since 49 have been local officials overcorrecting for fear of punishment by the center, right? So we have a much more top-down system here. It's not like the US where you have decentralized systems. The US government has a very hard time telling a state to do anything, right? I mean, it might give incentives, financially, or it might go to the Supreme Court. That's a very long process. But we do have a unitary state here. It's top-down. We have a ruling party that goes all the way down. It's quite a paradox because, China's a dynamic place. There's a lot of policy autonomy. Every locality in China wants to start its own AI, kind of incubator or development zone, and that's why China's gotten so successful economically. But the point I'm making is that when it's serious, the center does take control. America's had a pretty bad, death rate. I actually think America got the COVID policy it wanted. It traded off deaths and economic activity. America's economy had a much better performance than Europe. When you have a protest against a COVID policy, Austria, Netherlands, Sweden, wherever, so many of them, it's going to moderate that policy. And so whenever there's pushback against government policy, they own it too. Those people who protested, they own the deaths too. They said, we're going to take that death. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that in China, that doesn't happen. Only the party owns the deaths. So, in some ways I'm criticizing China, but actually trying to sympathize with it. When the party owns everything, they're going to be really careful because it's all on them. It's all their responsibility. We don't have these social actors and different parties and different movements and organizations either out in the streets or in en masse in the social media or in the media with these voices in China. So they can't own the deaths. Only the party does. And I think that's one way to think about, maybe in a more vivid way, the difference between China and the West.
A lot of our problems between US and China boil down to cultural differences. And I think you really just hit it right on the head there, because in America, we're always going to value our freedom over anything else, right? I mean, and that is, I would say that's probably the most American trait out there, right? Freedom is so valuable, people would die for it, and that is kind of the education that we're taught, right? We're taught, your ancestors have fought in wars for your freedom, you need to be grateful for that. So I think there is a trade-off there where in America, people will say, I'm going to take a risk. I will take my chances with COVID if you give me that freedom.
Whereas in China, we wouldn't see that. Many people have said, Cyrus, it's important to us, the elderly community. We're a society based on Confucianism.
Yeah,
We're very much are respecting our elders. We will do whatever we need to do to keep them safe. And I hope for
yeah,
China, they can just try to find a balance there. But it's tough. I mean, every government, you're trying to take care of the people. You're trying to do that. But I really like your point, right? The deaths, who are the deaths on, right? I mean, and the central government realizes that that's on them. And so they have that pressure, they have that pressure, and that is something that they want to make sure that they can control. So it's a very complicated situation in China for sure.
I mean, I've reiterated the party was founded to help the Chinese people have a better life. So it's in many ways, I'm making less of a cultural argument than a political argument. We can almost do this empirically. Around East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, these places, they also had a more collectivist spirit in COVID control. So there's a cultural element as well. But I think that the political history and regime makes a big difference too. So you'd mentioned Americans' love of freedom. I mean, our country was founded against a strong centralized state.
Right.
China and many other countries, actually, they needed a strong centralized state in order to enter the modern world. And
That's
so
right.
our experience in America actually it actually is exceptional. It's very different. And it makes us very hard to understand other countries, not just China, many countries. Germany is one country, too, that had a developmental state in the late 19th century, for example.
Right.
So we have a hard time understanding a strong state. But
the one thing that we all need is we do need China to, get through this. And we do need China to, we depend on China. It is the factory of the world. We can see the image of the container ships that are parked out on the sea in Shanghai, trying to dock. These are going to cause some major logistical supply chain issues, for the entire world moving forward. So I think it is something that everybody in the world, should be rooting for China, should be rooting for Shanghai to recover as quick as possible. And I want to thank you, Frank, for taking time out of your day, live in Shanghai to come on the program and share with us your real candid thoughts about many topics. I mean, we talked a lot about the ideologies, China, the government, your situation in Shanghai. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Sure. Thank you very much. I was really happy to have the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Everyone, thank you for taking time out of your day to spend it with me here on YouTube. If this is your first video of mine, I invite you to hit that subscribe button. And if you're interested to help this channel grow even faster, I invite you to come and join us on Patreon, where you can receive exclusive content from me and become part of our valuable team. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video soon.